Hey, today let's talk about the difference between an entrepreneur and an intrapreneur. An entrepreneur, I'm going to talk from the point of view of a startup entrepreneur, somebody that's working in a tech startup. Typically, this one is going to be a startup founder of any kind. It can be the CEO, the CTO, or the chief designer. But typically, it's going to be the CEO who is looking at the startup and trying to make sure that the startup is solving real problems for real people, finding product market fit, and making sure that it's building a viable business. Whereas the other one is going to be the intrapreneur. The intrapreneur is going to be somebody that is working for an established company, typically a relatively large tech company out there, and it doesn't necessarily have to be always a tech company. But in many cases, what an intrapreneur is going to be is somebody who within the organization is tasked to build a new product for a specific market and has to bring that product successfully into the market. So what are going to be the main focuses for an entrepreneur in a startup? Obviously, as a startup founder and a startup CEO, you're going to have a lot of things that you have to pay attention to. There's going to be some of them that you are going to have to focus a lot. Typically, this is going to be finding the right product market fit. This means that when you find product market fit, you have found a good solution that people like and use and are willing to pay for it, that solves a real problem or need that they have. That moment is when you have found product market fit. And this is not just selling one or two units of your product. The second focus area that a startup entrepreneur is going to have is the ability to pivot. Being able to pivot and to change direction is going to be very important for a startup entrepreneur in order to find and achieve that product market fit. Pivot means that understand that at some point you had to make a very critical decision that do I stay course or do I pivot to a new direction? Potentially the first problem that you have identified was not the correct one. If this was the correct one, potentially the amount of people having that problem was not enough to create a business. Another one is that you have found the proper problem, you have found a good amount of people, you are not solving the problem in the correct way. If you are failing at one of these, then you had to pivot and make sure that you are aligning in those three key points. The third one that you want to have as a startup entrepreneur is that you want to build a business around the vision that you have. Your goal as a startup entrepreneur is that at some point you want to be able to have a sustainable business that can sustain itself. This might mean that in some cases you are going to be operating at a loss for a long time because your focus is on growth, and while you are getting investment from different VCs, you want to make sure that you are able to grow as fast as possible so you can reach that position that you want to be in the future. But at some point you have to make sure that you are going to have a business model that allows you to run your operations in a profitable way. You can see examples of this in many companies. There are many public companies nowadays that they are quite popular out there who are still operating at a loss. Most of the EV manufacturers, the purely EV manufacturers are there. At this point, they're operating at a loss. They're just basically trying to grow as fast as they can. Think about, for example, Rivian or Lucid. Tesla nowadays is a profitable company. The fourth one that is going to be very important for a startup entrepreneur is to understand how many times can you change direction, pivot, until you achieve product market fit. This is going to be very important because your rounds of funding are going to give you a lifeline on the amount of times that you can be working until you achieve that product market fit. So it's very important to understand how many of these iterations can you run through until you are successfully funding your position. Then is when you can get the next round of funding that is going to help you achieve higher positions, or potentially you don't need more rounds of funding and then you are starting to be a profitable business that can be run on its own. An intrapreneur, on the other hand, is going to have somehow similar worries, but it's going to have a different set of important things that are going to affect him or her in their journey. So first of all, an entrepreneur typically is going to report to some kind of organization, corporation that is going to want to understand how they're investing the money, how it's distributed, how it's going to be in the future potentially profitable. And it depends on the corporation. These entrepreneurs might have a relatively free hand on the way that they operate, but in some cases they are going to be very tight on the way that they had to operate. So they might not be able to do things as they would like to. So if they are able to do things as they would like to, they still can run things in a very agile way. They can do experimentation, they can do user research, user testing, do MVPs, and go to market relatively fast to get feedback on the products that they are building. They are going to be able to use that feedback to evolve the product in the direction that it should go. But what the entrepreneur is going to have to do is to have to focus on how to report the progress or the plans for this internal startup that is being run within the higher or the bigger corporation. You could argue, of course, that the startup also is going to have to report to the VCs, if they have funding, what is the status and the progress of what they are doing. Of course, the entrepreneur is going to have the same problem with being able to achieve product market fit. They have to make sure that they have identified the correct user personas that they are trying to tackle a problem from, and that they are building valid solutions for them. An entrepreneur also will have to understand the needs of pivoting and how can they make sure that they can change course when needed in order to find that product market fit. And as well, the entrepreneur will have to worry about the number of times that they can pivot and that they can test that solution until they find that product market fit. One thing that the entrepreneur is going to have that potentially is going to be very different from a startup entrepreneur is that typically a startup entrepreneur has to find a new team, has to build a new team from the start. An entrepreneur potentially cannot build a team from scratch. They might have to build a team with people that are coming from other units in the corporation. This can mean many things, and one of the challenges here is finding the right people that you can bring this startup within a corporation culture. It is not so easy to change culture, to change the mentality of people. Not being able to choose the people that you're going to be working with from the beginning might be a potential challenge for somebody that is a startup intrapreneur. Something that is going to be important for the entrepreneur is all the reporting. But on the other hand, for these entrepreneurs that are running a startup within the company, usually there's the cushion of the bigger corporation that if the project fails, that doesn't mean that the whole thing disappears. It doesn't mean that necessarily everybody is going to run out of their jobs. It potentially means that the startup within the corporation is going to disappear. That is a potential outcome. But that doesn't mean that there's going to be a failure of the whole corporation because of this startup failing at what they're doing. Which on the case of the actual startup and the startup entrepreneur is a very real case that if they fail to find product market fit, it might be that the whole startup and everybody that is working there is basically out of business. So these people working as startup entrepreneurs and intrapreneurs within a larger corporation, in the end are going to have a very similar goal. It's not going to be exactly the same path because of the risks involved, especially when you are an actual startup. But in the end, what you want to do is that you want to build and find a proper product that can sustain itself and you can build it into a business in the long term. And if done right, which is never easy, you can then do proper product experimentation and be able to get as fast and as soon as possible to your actual product market fit. One of the biggest problems of companies is not building the right solutions. So many people, many companies, especially existing companies, and also to a very large degree within startups happens, they think that they know the solution that their customers need. And that's not necessarily the reality all the time. Actually, it's rarely the case. Usually you have to understand really well what is the problem in order to build a proper solution. If you want to hear more about the problem that you're trying to tackle for your customers, go and check out this video. So how about you? Are you a startup entrepreneur? Are you an intrapreneur working within a larger company? Typically, these entrepreneurs can be people like even product managers, product heads of product, somebody that is trying to drive a new product within a larger organization. Let us know in the comments below. I will see you in the next video, and remember, stay safe.